everyone, and welcome to King Arthur and Lady of the Lake. Today we are talking about something really topical, and it's all about anger. Is anger demonized by society? My answer would be yes. What do you think, Michael?
And my answer would be yes too.
Mm.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. So, 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 Helen, let's pre-frame this for everybody a little bit. We
Mm.
came up with this. We came up with the title for this because we've both had experiences with our own anger and other people's projection of anger onto their anger onto us as well.
Mm. Mm.
And we are taught as young people that anger is actually not a good emotion. We're taught that it's a negative emotion, that we shouldn't show anger, and that it's wrong to feel anger. I
Mm.
know I was taught that. What were you taught growing up? Were you taught that anger was not a good thing?
I think anything but happiness is discouraged. I really do. I find anything but happiness to be discouraged. Like to cry is kind of makes people uncomfortable. And so what
Yeah,
I find then is why anger fascinates me so much. And as you know, talking to men about anger as well, when people are dealing with feelings that are hard, that are uncomfortable, they actually turn into anger. So
yeah,
suppressed emotion becomes anger because we're enraged that we can't really share what we really feel. And so that's why I believe anger is so prevalent in our society, because we're actually not allowed to feel anything. So what happens when we're growing up is it's kind of like, especially for women, where's that smile, love? Put the smile on your face. Like, come on, oh, be positive. And at the moment, we've gone through this whole period of be positive, be positive, be positive. And my
yeah,
kids, I have this problem with all of these resilience things in the schools because it's not about being resilient, it's about being positive. So it's not about going, yes, it's okay to be angry, and yes, it's okay. It's like, you don't have to do that, think differently. But it's not true. We
mm,
can't just think over our feelings. Our feelings exist within us. So I don't know whether we're actually allowed to be anything other than happy. But the fact is, then the suppression of all of the emotion of anxiety, of discomfort, of sadness, of crying, for goodness sake. Oh my
yeah,
God,
yeah,
fancy crying in front of somebody, that's just awful. That gets suppressed and then shows as anger, and then we're shamed for anger.
yeah,
Even
exactly.
more interesting to me is that anger in men seems to be revered by other men rather than, it's much, much easier and better to be angry and feared in a male community. And I'm interested in your take on this, rather than be seen to be weak and upset and cry.
Yes, yes, and I will contextualize my answer by
Mm.
saying that most children, so our parents don't intentionally try to suppress feelings in us, right? They're actually trying to help us to manage our emotions as well as they possibly can at their level of awareness. And so what I mean by that is that when we say anger is suppressed, what that really means is that any negative emotion we're encouraged, and you've kind of touched on this, we're encouraged to feel the opposite. Like, don't cry, it's okay, right? There's no need to be anxious. There's no need to be upset. It's okay. Don't worry about it, right? So worry, fear, anxiety, anger, we're encouraged to step out of it really quickly into something that feels more comfortable for the other person,
Yeah.
right? And and so when we look at male environments where there's men, like what feels more comfortable for men is not necessarily tears, anxiety, worry, etc., because we're told that that's weak. So, what's the opposite of that? Frustration, anger, displays of aggression, for instance, and verbally how that's actually expressed.
Mm.
And so, what I always teach men is, you know what, you don't have to have one or the other. There's this really good middle ground where you can say, you know what, I'm actually feeling frustrated, angry, annoyed about this particular thing. And then other people can create space for that to be explored.
mm, mm.
What happens is that when you allow that to be explored and you don't demonize anger and you don't make fear and anxiety a negative thing, for instance, when you start to create space for that emotion to be explored, then you can start to, it has a, what word am I looking for here? It has a outlet.
Mm,
It has an outlet. When you don't give these emotions an outlet, they become suppressed and then they come out in unhealthy ways.
mm. Yeah, that's exactly what I think. Yeah, I find it for women on the other side of it, it's seen as hysterical. You know, when women get angry about something, oh, she went mental. You
Yep.
know, like there's
She's
like some
crazy.
kind of craziness about
Yep.
women who get angry,
Yep.
that there's something wrong with them. Like it's just like she was out of control. Like she was out of control. She was hysterical. She went
Yep.
mental. All of that kind of thing. That it's really it's kind of that, oh, she's a nutcase, and it's
And
seen
do
as
you know what, Helen?
mm,
Do you know what? I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to just speak into that because I think men could take some responsibility in the context of an intimate relationship, for instance. I think men could take responsibility for these, what we might call irrational emotional outbursts from women, because I will put my hand up and say that I was a man who did not hold space or listen to or allow a woman to be heard.
mm,
And so, and so you do that for long enough and you don't provide that environment, then what happens is that any person, woman or man, any person is going to eventually yell and go crazy in an effort to seek to be heard,
mm, mm,
right? And so when women project that, it usually takes a long time for a woman to get to a point where she's going, well, you just fucking listen to me. And then
yeah,
it's like, just relax, right?
yeah.
Calm the farm. It's okay. And and that's even worse, right? So I think we all get to a point where we just want to be heard. We
Mm,
just want to be heard.
mm, mm,
And men express it in anger and aggression when they don't feel like they're being heard.
mm.
And that's demonized, and we're told that's bad, so we suppress even more. And women project it in very similar ways. And women are told, well, that's bad, and you shouldn't be acting like that because you're being crazy, right?
Yeah,
Men violent, women are crazy. And
mm,
so if we can just create space somewhere in the middle
mm.
of the violence and the craziness for open expression and communication around how we feel, then I think no one needs to feel like they're crazy and no one needs to feel like they're out of control.
And this is the thing, though. What's interesting, Michael, is that we're talking about the parents at home kind of encouraging feelings to be heard. And then we're talking about what happens within our relationships. But the
Yep,
biggest thing I find is the social narrative. The social narrative, which is what really impacts us growing up from our peer group and makes us feel accepted or a part of belonging or isolated or whatever it is, or whether we become embarrassed,
yep,
and then how the ego is then bruised by the social narrative of these emotions. And so when you look at how kids act in schools and the encouragement that they have from peers, and then also then when you get into being an adult and around networking groups or just adult friendships, it's also there's a decision that's already been made almost about how we should behave. And so whether we learn from our parents to behave differently or whether we are in a relationship that doesn't allow it, what do you think about the social narrative? Because I find that even though I might have said something to my children, they could go to school and they would be ridiculed for behaving in that way that feels normal
yep.
to them because they're being encouraged at home.
So we've got to look at this big thing that we call a social narrative and start to break it down a little bit, because a social narrative is a collective opinion.
That's
Okay. It's a collective opinion. That's what a social narrative is. And the collective is full of individuals. And so individuals, and we've just talked about individuals. So the collective actually, or the or the narrative actually starts with the individual and what they've been taught is appropriate, right? And then you create enough individuals that have been taught this is the appropriate way to manage your feelings, and this is appropriate way to express your feelings, and this is how you should think and should feel, etc., and how you should act. All of a sudden, we have enough individuals doing that and believing that, and we have a social narrative. And
mm,
so, and so this is why I don't necessarily believe so much in this social political kind of environment. I believe that we are there should be more of an individual. If we change as an individual and enough people change as an individual, then we affect the collective.
mm,
Then we
mm,
start to change the social narrative around that. We look at the great movements around the world and in history, what they've done is they've actually changed the individual narrative of millions of people,
mm.
hundreds of thousands or millions of people, which has brought about societal change and
Yeah.
changed the societal narrative. And so it's a very big thing when we start to talk about, well, we need to change the narrative in society, because it's like, how can I as an individual do that? Then we're talking about other things as well, like identity politics, identity. There's so much stuff that we could go, so many rabbit holes, but I know we're trying to keep these to about 20 minutes, these episodes. So I think it needs to start with the individual. I really do. And enough individuals need to take up the mantle,
Mm,
and go, yeah, this is not working for me and it's not working for us. And so we need to change the societal narrative by changing enough individual narratives. And those narratives need to be about it is actually okay to feel anger. It's
mm,
okay to be frustrated. It's
mm,
okay to feel annoyed. And so what's a good way to express that in a way that I take responsibility for my own emotions and I don't project my shit onto other people?
mm,
And how can I surround myself with more people who feel and think the same so that we can support each other in this? And
mm,
if there's enough of these little pockets and groups and factions, if you like, of people who are willing to take responsibility for their negative emotions and not judge them as such,
mm,
then we start to create uh, a different society, a different narrative in society.
mm, mm. Yeah, because I find that there's so much suppression of anger that that's why we get the scary numbers that we do around violence.
Yeah.
And
And
um,
suicide and all sorts
yeah,
of different things. Yeah.
and anger does go one of two ways. Anger can be channeled within, which causes suicide, and anger also goes out. So this is the other thing about anger, is that anger seems to be okay if you just kind of turning it inwards. Self-criticism in a way is encouraged, because you're not allowed to actually be happy with yourself. So it's
Yep.
more comfortable for people to see you disillusioned with yourself than it is to be happy with yourself. So it's again one of those things where it's not acceptable to be seen to be happy with yourself, but it's encouraged to not be.
Yep.
So you've got the suicide rate, which is extremely high, as we know, and then of course we've got the killings and murders through violence because of, on the other end. I
Yep.
just find it really interesting that as well, behind anger is the actual real emotion of what really is going on. So
And it's
only
usually
by
fear.
crashing through the anger, which means that you allow it, can you actually remove it to then see what's really going on, because anger is normally the mask of the truth.
And I might say that underneath anger is fear,
Mm, mm,
and underneath fear is the actual issue. Like, what are we actually afraid of? Are we afraid of losing our relationship, losing our minds, losing our status
mm,
in society,
mm,
losing our identity? What are we actually afraid of losing? Because underneath anger is always a fear of loss,
mm,
and it's usually attached with something that we have identified ourselves with, that we need externally in order to feel like a relevant human being and that we're approved of and validated. So it's a good awareness that I came to a long time ago, that underneath my anger was fear. And when I started to connect with what is it that I'm afraid of, generally speaking, for most people, there's a fear of being judged,
mm,
right? There's
mm,
a fear of being judged, or there's a fear of not being heard, or there's a fear of not being accepted, or something like that. They're really deep-seated um, things at our very essence, at our core, that people fear. They
Mm.
fear not being accepted. They fear not being part of the collective. They
Well,
fear
that's why we're suppressing in the first place, isn't it?
because
Because,
that's why we're suppressing.
you
Because
know,
if we express, then we might be rejected.
but as well, with I think for some people, who am I without being angry? I don't think, I think there's a real terror of if they let that anger go,
Yeah,
that they'd actually have to find out who they are without it. Anger's a very easy kind of space to sit. People know how to behave when they're angry. They can be quite mean to people because they're in that space, so it keeps people away from actually getting to know them. They
yeah,
can do all these different behaviors that come from anger to keep them isolated within their own anger, because that is safer for them, they've discovered, than going beneath it, because
yeah,
that is actually really quite difficult. So that is also, I think, what really plays into the demonizing anger, because the people who are in that space are actually really mean to everybody they meet, and you end up going, that guy or that woman, they're just really angry and nasty,
yeah,
because they've decided that that's just a really good space for them to sit in. But had they been in a place where, like you say, we're changing the narrative, where they would have been allowed to feel other things as they were coming through their life, they couldn't have hit a point where they would never have got there.
yeah. And underneath all of that, underneath that place of people feeling like this is just me, I actually just want to be angry with the world. And I don't think people actually make that choice consciously. I think it's a pattern of repetitive behaviors over
It's
time
easier.
and thoughts, and it's easier. And do you know why it's easier? Because it means that if we're blaming and finding fault externally, we don't have to take responsibility for ourselves, and we don't have to turn that all inwards and go, how am I creating the experience of life that I am? Or at the very least, co-creating this experience with somebody else, right? And then that requires us to take responsibility. And people would rather blame and find fault externally with other people and other circumstances and situations than
Mm.
take responsibility for themselves. And I think that is the thing that people fear the most. People
And
fear the
that's
most.
why we demonize it then, isn't it? Because of
That's why
that,
we demonize it. Yep.
because that's the kind of anger where you're just kind of going, oh God, like there's no need to be that angry about it. And so
Yeah,
it demonizes anger, but that's not healthy anger. That's running from everything anger.
totally.
But yeah, the whole thing of, well, maybe if we could feel our feelings in the first place, all of our range of feelings,
Yep.
that we wouldn't reach the heights of the anger that we have in our society today. So
Yeah. I
there is hope
totally
for
agree
the
with that,
future.
Helen.
Mm.
Totally agree with that. And if we were to summarize this discussion, because I know we have to finish up in a minute. So if we were to summarize this discussion, I might say that the some of the steps that people could take, like it's good to have this discussion, but then I'd love to give people value around some of the steps that they could take to begin to take responsibility for their suppression, right? Because we've all done it and sometimes we still do it. And so what we could choose to do is to create space within ourselves to feel the extent of our emotions. That's the first thing. And do so in an environment where that's not going to affect other people. And so we might need to remove ourselves from an environment where there are other people, so our projections don't affect them. That's the first thing. Take responsibility for yourself and allow yourself to feel the full range of emotions. Second, be really honest with yourself about how you're feeling and why. And if you possibly can, take away the external projection and the propensity that we all have to blame and find fault externally, turn that inwards and think about what is it that I'm actually fearful of here? Because anger, aggression, and the propensity for violence sometimes, underneath all of that, there's a fear. So be honest with yourself about what is that fear. You don't have to tell anyone. You don't have to make it known to anyone. You certainly don't have to put it on Facebook. But what you could choose to do is you could just admit and acknowledge to yourself that I'm actually afraid here that if I express these feelings to my partner, perhaps he/she will think that I can't handle myself. And
Mm.
there's a fear of rejection there or a fear
Mm.
of judgment. And
Mm.
so sit with that,
Mm.
right? and work through that and internalize that and take the time that you need. And so what we usually find is when we allow ourselves to process our emotions at that depth, we usually then are more conscious in our projections when we encounter another person, or when we have the discussion with our partner, for instance, or with our friend, or with our child, or whoever it might be. And
Mm,
so that might be the advice that I could give
mm.
around that. Mm.
And also to have patience with the process, that it's not going to happen after just one kind of internal dialogue. It's not going to happen after
Yeah,
two. This is ongoing work that goes on daily, and
yeah,
and really does, if you do have a propensity to really feel angry other than everything else, then that's going to take a couple of years to deprogram. But it has to start with the self-reflection,
yeah,
and removing, one of the sayings that I always have: you can't keep the movie going if the lead star leaves. When the lead star walks off the set, the movie stops filming. So
yeah,
if there's a conflict constantly going on, then if you walk out of it's going to stop, isn't it? So there has to be that moment where you choose to really pull out, become the observer, and really look at your part in whatever it is that you're playing. And it's not going to happen quickly. So
yeah.
have patience, compassion, as always. I was going on and on about that, but it's true. Compassion for the other person, for yourself. Mm.
Awesome.
Mm.
Good. That was another good discussion. Hello, I enjoy our discussions. We should do this more often.
Who knows what we'll talk about next time, but we'll
Who
see you then,
knows?
everybody.
Thank you for watching.
Thanks, guys. Bye.